الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وأفوض أمري إلى الله إن الله بصير بالعباد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي والحمد لله رب العالمين ثم الصلاة والسلام على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين وجميع عباده الصالحين. السلام عليك سيدي ومولاي يا أبا عبد الله. Peace and blessings be upon you, O the Master of freedom seekers and freedom fighters in this world, O Hussein. وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك الشريف, and peace and blessings be upon the noble souls, the courageous souls which were raised in your presence on the day of Ashura. وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك وأناخت برحلك الطاهر عليك مني سيدي ومولاي وعليك منا سلام الله أبدا ما بقينا وبقي الليل والنهار. And from Australia 2020, O Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, we convey to you our deepest love and faith and trust in your legacy. ولا جعله الله آخر العهد منا لزيارتكم والسير على نهجكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين ورحمة الله وبركاته. Respected brothers, respected sisters present with us in person, respected brothers and sisters following us online, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, يجاهدون في سبيل الله ولا يخافون لومة لائم ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله واسع عليم. Those who strive in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do not fear, they have the courage not to fear the reproach and the blame of other people as they are steadfast in working and striving for the ideals of their cause and purpose in life. ذَلِكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ. Such is Allah's favor. يُؤْتِيهِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. He grants it to whoever He will. وَاللَّهُ وَاسِعٌ عَلِيمٌ. Indeed, Allah is boundless in His knowledge and bounty. Courage from the cradle to the grave. You may ask, why did you choose to make the title about the virtue of courage from the cradle to the grave? Meaning from the bed of the baby to the grave, to the end of a lifetime in one's life. It is because cradle and grave, or cradle to the grave, is a marketing strategy in today's world, where super consumerism, companies, corporations, seeking to target people for their products. Today we are all consumers. We consume goods, we consume services, we consume clothing, we consume food, But this does not come without a particular cost. We consume it in return to building an identity, who you are. So they came up with this strategy which is known as from the cradle to the grave, believing that in order for these advertising and marketing companies to survive in the long run, they should not only focus on adults, they should start from children. How? Through billboards, brands, TV commercials, product placements, and so on and so forth. To the point that Dr. Hiba Rauf Izzat, one of the great Muslim women intellectuals from Egypt, she says, at one point my son came up to me wanting money to purchase something from the corner shop. But I was fascinated by the way he was reflecting this super consumerism culture in our day and age. He said to her, "Mama, give me money." She said to him, "What do you want to buy with the money?" He said, "I want to buy." Dr. Hiba Rauf Izzat says, when I was his age, back in the days when I was a child, I would go up to my mother and ask her for money to buy a cocktail drink. Whereas my son today does not even specify to me what he wants to buy. In other words, this marketing strategy, which is becoming a reality, is making us want to buy for the sake of buying. And that is how we have become enslaved to these companies without even knowing. My dear brothers and sisters, courage is one of the most universally admired virtues across human history and across different cultures. We need the virtue of courage to fight such strategies and techniques that enslave us. We shouldn't be resisting the world of consumerism because we are part of it, but we should be resisting the world of super consumerism that reduces our entire existence to one dimension. How do we make sense of the virtue of courage? What is the virtue of courage? How do we see, how can we practice the virtue of courage in today's world? What's its contemporary form? Is it still relevant? When I say the word courage, the first thing that comes to mind, for example, is winning an 800-meter race. When I say courage, some people think jumping off the cliff. Other people think fighting in a battlefield. You may think of the warriors of history when you come across the word courage or the virtue courage. You may think of knights, of Saxons and pirates under the worst circumstances of our history. But what if we had to unlearn what we were taught about courage? How would we approach it? Do you know the etymological root of the word courage in the English language? It comes from the Latin word cor, C-O-R, which means of the heart. In other words, courage referred to the process of telling a story about who you are with your whole heart. كل يوم عاشوراء وكل أرض كربلاء. Every day is Ashura and every land is Karbala. Recall with me how we could make sense of this story, of this courageous legacy in history, which is summarized in a code, كل يوم عاشوراء وكل أرض كربلاء. In your struggles in the 21st century, you are living the day of Ashura. In the struggles of your school environment, you are in the land of Karbala. In the struggles of your character growth, in your relationships, You are on the day of Ashura. There are no boundaries. There are no limits to being inspired from Ashura and from the land of Karbala. How do we make sense of this in the historical and universal context? Do you know that كل يوم عاشوراء وكل أرض كربلاء had existed even before the historical day of Ashura and before the land of Karbala? Recall with me, in India, how great heroes across history exemplified the legacy of Ashura. Let me give you an example. In the Indian subcontinent, as well as Nepal and Bangladesh, these countries that exist in the same region of the world, there is an interesting story that took place there in history which reminds us of كل يوم عاشوراء وكل أرض كربلاء. Recall the king who wanted his son to become a powerful and mighty ruler. He created the most pleasant life in the palace, and he said to his queen, wife, I will make sure that this palace is so pleasant and comfortable that our son will never think of leaving it. Soon, Siddhartha, who became known later as Buddha, the enlightened man, became disillusioned with the palace of his father, which is supposedly the most comfortable and the most pleasant. And he started witnessing the sufferings of humanity in the world. He asked a question one day to himself and to the people around him. What is the meaning of living a pleasant life in a luxurious and lavish palace when people around the world are suffering? He broke apart, he left the palace, he went on a 7-year journey, and he was transformed 180 degrees. Who would ever think of leaving a palace? This man did it. Doesn't this remind you of the story of Musa alayhi salam in the Quran? And the name Musa in the Quran is mentioned around 136 times. The most mentioned prophet in the Quran. And the story of Musa alayhi salam in the Quran is scattered and distributed in more than 10 chapters. We said courage is about telling a story about who you are with your whole heart. The Buddha expressed it with his whole heart, and I just mentioned it to you. Let's look at the story of Musa alayhi salam and his version of courage. Musa alayhi salam exits the palace of the Pharaoh, which reminds you of the story I just mentioned. Then he goes to Madian, in which he stays there for 10 years, working hard, not just to earn a living, but to develop his sense of responsibility, his readiness to carry on a message for the world, before he became a prophet. And then later he received revelation. Allah says in Surah Al-Qasas, فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُ وَقَصَّ عَلَيْهِ الْقَصَصَ قَالَ لَا تَخَفْ نَجَوْتَ مِنَ الْقَوْمِ الظَّالِمِينَ. Look at the connection between the virtue of courage in its original meaning and how Musa alayhi salam was telling the story of his values and life to the old man. When Moses came to him after he watered the flock and he helped the 2 girls, the old man said, after Musa told him his story, "O Musa, do not be afraid. You have been saved from the oppressors. O Musa, you have now become the voice of the oppressed, and you will become the spokesman of the oppressed." Musa alayhi salam continues his journey and you know the rest of the story. Inshallah, we can touch on it in the coming nights. كل يوم عاشوراء وكل أرض كربلاء. Recall in Athens, when the governing body of Athens, in what is known today as Greece, when the governing body of that city threatened Socrates, the wise man in history, to either face death or stop teaching people how to reach the truth. What do you think was the response of Socrates? Which reminds you of كل يوم عاشوراء وكل أرض كربلاء. He said no, and he refused. He picked up the cup of poison and drank the poison, refusing to escape voluntarily from the prison. They offered him to escape, and virtually speaking, he had the right, because just as he was clashing with the law, but Socrates wanted to stand for justice without disobeying the law. And he said to them, an unexamined life is not worth living. Doesn't this remind you of ألا إن الدعي ابن الدعي قد ركز بين اثنتين بين السلة والذلة وهيهات من الذلة? When Imam Hussein alayhi salam announced that if they offer me a choice of two, either I face the sword and death, or I accept humiliation in return for a false sense of security, for a false sense of existence in life without meaning, I will face death out of courage. كل يوم عاشوراء وكل أرض كربلاء. Recall Muslim bin Aqil, when he was in the house of Sharik or Hani bin Urwa, and they offered him the opportunity to kill Ubaydillah ibn Ziyad through the back. What did Muslim bin Aqil say, and how did he act on the virtue of courage? They were calling upon him, they were indicating to him, now it's the time, you can be opportunistic. Let's entrap Ubaydillah ibn Ziyad and assassinate him. He said to them, this is the story of Muslim bin Aqil, and this is the version of his story. سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله يقول الإيمان قيد الفتك والمؤمن لا يفتك. I heard a tradition from the final messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وآله saying, faith, true Iman prevents you from committing treacherous assassination. A believer, a true faithful person, would not commit treacherous assassination. كل يوم عاشوراء وكل أرض كربلاء. How do we make sense of this in the modern day? Have you heard of Christ Church? And I'm sure you've witnessed what happened last year on TV. When the New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern visited members of the Muslim refugee camp and the Muslim community, she came down from the ivory tower of her governance responsibility down to the earth, at the same level of the people, dressed in black, as we do in Ashura, as we do in Muharram, and wearing a Muslim-style headscarf. She joined those people who were disheartened by what happened, and she had her own story of who she was with a whole heart, the virtue of courage. She was shedding tears, and she summarized the philosophy of her courage in life, which is كل يوم عاشوراء وكل أرض كربلاء, by saying 3 words: united in grief. She remembered Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam without necessarily knowing his identity, when she said, I refuse to believe that you cannot be both strong and compassionate. Doesn't this remind you of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam on the day of Ashura, when he stood like a warrior, exemplifying the best image and the best practice of bravery, and yet he had the courage to shed the tears of mercy for the enemy, and yet he had the courage till the last point of negotiation to keep that dialogue going until they understand. My dear brothers and sisters, the virtue of courage is a cardinal virtue, meaning it is a virtue which we cannot realize other virtues without it, as virtue ethic philosophers taught us. You know why? It is because other virtues such as generosity we can practice under normal circumstances. But when you are tested with losing your wealth whilst exercising generosity, this very act, if it doesn't have courage with it, it will most likely be deflected. It will most likely be reversed. And the same applies with other virtues. Whereas the virtue of courage is never deflected. Why? Because it is from the very start intended to penetrate the dangers and the risks and the fears we face in any situation we face in life. Why is this topic important for us today? I will reveal its importance by sharing with you a study which took place a while ago in Princeton Theological Seminary. A group of researchers wanted to test why some people take opportunities to do good and help others on some occasions, whilst missing out and turning a blind eye to many other opportunities on other occasions. They divided the people who were in the study into two groups. The first group, they were all students of divinity and theology, so bear in mind, these people were studying religion day and night. But let's see the outcome of a culture or a society that lacks the virtue of courage. Even if it had all the rituals, even if it had all the commemorations and the ceremonies and the values, but if it misses the virtue of courage, whatever they do loses its meaning with a blink of an eye. Two groups, students of divinity. The first group were given a parable that talks about a man who helps a stranger in need of help by the side of the road. The Good Samaritan. The second group, the second half, was given random topics from the Bible. And they were told that you will be delivering a practice sermon in another building, next to the building from where they started. The researchers deliberately placed a person in the middle between the first building and the second building, lying bent down on the ground, moaning, screaming, in need of help. So when these students were rushing to give their sermon in the other block of building, they bypassed this man without even pausing to reflect on his needs and to come to his rescue. So the question was, what determined whether these people would stop and help? The most interesting question was, were these people contemplating and thinking through the content of what they were studying and what they were about to deliver? What they found out was a tragedy of our time. These people were caught up in reaching the other building on time so that they can deliver the sermon. Isn't this an example of our tragedy in our day and age? when we lack the virtue of courage. You are about to deliver something in helping other people, but you come across someone in need of your help and you are caught up by the sense of hurry and rush. These are moments of Ashura and Karbala. These are moments of Al-Hur bin Yazid al-Riyahi. You choose. You can either be like Al-Hur or you can be like others who were oblivious and who did not pay attention to their surroundings and to their society. My dear brothers and sisters, today evil is no longer solid. When you say to me, who is Yazid bin Muawiyah in our day and age? As a sociologist, I can't tell you he is a character. Obviously there are characters that exemplify the example of Yazid. But I'm talking here at a larger scale. Evil today has become less visible and very hard to spot and resist. You know why? Because the evil of today's society is no longer a person, it's a routine. The Yazid of our time today is a routine and not a person. And because it is a routine, it lurks. It actually penetrates our everyday practices and lifestyles without us feeling it. To the point that this Yazid living with us every day is something that brings us comfort and keeps us in a state of falsified happiness. And you know, every time I reflect on this meaning of evil, I remember the tobacco companies. How in the second half of the 20th century, they were doing all these research projects in order to convince people that cigarettes are not harmful. To the point that one research paper after another was being produced to serve these companies. Isn't this Yazid bin Muawiyah in the form of knowledge that is false, intending to keep us enslaved until a whistleblower? I'm sure you've heard of this term, a whistleblower. You know, a referee in a soccer match, he uses the whistle when there is a foul. He says, let's stop the game and give the foul. This is called a whistleblower. An example of someone who is on the path of Imam Hussein alayhi salam in our day and age is known as a whistleblower. Someone who works inside a company and discovers that this company is working against the human being in morally, spiritually, socially, psychologically, emotionally, he uses the weapon of the whistle. He blows it. And he says to us, be awake, be careful. This is what they are trying to do to entrap you. Will you respond or will you resist? Will you stand or will you fall? My dear brothers and sisters, in 1995, in a famous interview, the American journalist Mike Wallace, he interviewed a biochemist who was working on these tobacco research projects to convince people that these companies can create reduced harm cigarettes for you. So you don't have to quit, but we can create reduced harm types of cigarettes to give you that peace of mind. In an interview with Wallace, his name was Jeffrey Wigand. He said, and this is the whistleblowing, big tobacco companies are engineering the fact that cigarettes are intended to make you addictive to this habit. All the drama behind the research was about this single most important weapon. How can we secure? How can we make people continue to consume by making cigarettes addictive. But this is not the end of the story. There are whistleblowers today working in other companies that have to do with social media. These whistleblowers say to us, engineers in social media platforms are those who are tobacco farmers wearing a t-shirt and creating products in order to make our children addicted to the technology. Let me give you one example. If the tobacco companies wanted your lungs, these new social media platforms want your soul. In other words, they want your attention. How do we become entrapped in the Yazid of our everyday life? When our attention is hijacked. When our attention is always on social media and we pay no attention to the real world and to the real issues of our lives. What really stood out to me when I was reflecting on some statistics and some figures when it comes to the world of social media was that our attention today isn't just hijacked. Our attention is destroyed. We no longer have any sense of attention in the first place. Do you know that more than 1 billion person using YouTube today, every single minute, uploads more than, there is an uploading of more than 400 hours of YouTube online by more than 1 billion person? Can you imagine? Can you imagine that more than 216,000 photos are being uploaded every minute on Instagram? Can you believe it that 5.5 million videos are being viewed on Snapchat every single minute? When we say evil is in our everyday lives, we are not saying that these platforms are evil, but rather how we interact with them and the power they have on our souls and on our attention are the liquid evil I am referring to. My dear brothers and sisters, I'll finish off in 5 minutes and I'll conclude by saying, if we need the virtue of courage today, don't you think we need to be aware of these problems in our society? How do we find out why there is an addiction to social media? What are the consequences of this addiction? I want to give you 3 techniques you can use. The first technique is what the individual behavior is in the context of traits. If you wanted to describe this generation today, what are some of the traits, some of the behavioral traits that you see? Number 1, shyness. Number 2, impulsiveness, quick to react. Number 3, lack of focus. Number 4, addiction. Now, how do we dig deeper to find out where these kind of psychological and behavioral problems emerged? You know, when you say, I want to understand something, you are referring to 2 words, under and stand. In order for you to understand something, you got to dig deep and go under what you see on the surface. If I see someone addicted to social media and I want to understand their situation, I have to dig under this addiction and see what factors, what things in social life are making him addicted to social media, or to pornography, or to video games. When I dig deep and I reach the under, I have to stand. Understand. I have to make what I find with the virtue of courage underneath the surface, in the deep of the ground of the society, I need to make it stand. I need to bring it to light, like Imam Hussein alayhi salam did when he said, أَلَا تَرَوْنَ بِأَنَّ الْحَقَّ لَا يُعْمَلُ بِهِ. Do you not see that people know the truth, but they don't practice it. They don't act on it. And I will make it stand as a reality to teach you the virtue of courage. No one was willing to make this reality stand except Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. And that is why he is teaching us how to understand. You know, the virtue of courage is best exemplified in times of hopelessness, when there is an unpromising reality in your time. You know, all the odds are against you. You have limited resources. When you say to people, I want to help my community, they say to you, there is no hope in helping your community. Your community doesn't want to change. There is no hope in lifting people from the slums and from the downtrodden circumstances of their lives to your ideals and to your cause. You know, the virtue of courage in the legacy of Ashura was about a group of people, Al-Hussein, his family and his companions, in the midst, in the center of a reality that was hopeless and helpless. They stood up to create what Sayyid al-Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr describes as al-Hazza fi al-Damir. He said, Maut al-Damir was the reality during the time of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He wasn't talking about the individual Damir, he was talking about the collective conscience. You know, you see evil, but you say, who cares? You don't feel and feel the evil. Sayyid al-Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr says this is a phenomenon known as Maut al-Damir, the death of the collective conscience. And so the Imam had to exercise the virtue of courage to break this idol and to break this silence. Going back to the three techniques I mentioned. Number one, the behavioral traits. Number two, you dig into the land, into the society, you reach the second level. You ask, what are the situations that are bringing out the conditions that are making this person behave the way they are behaving? For example, widespread fatherlessness. There's no longer the father figure in society. On the day of Ashura, we saw the father figure. The relationship between Ali al-Akbar and Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam. The father figure, not necessarily biologically. The father figure can be a mentor, can be a role model in your community. Exciting video games, that's another situational factor. Free access to pornography, that's another situational factor. Why do you think young boys today are not successful emotionally, sexually, and academically? It's because they have free access to these dangerous territories in their lives, and they are feeling comfortable, but obviously it's a false sense of comfort in these realms. Why should I interact with people? Why should I do well at school? I can live this instant gratification which gives me a quick sense of joy, and I keep repeating it. That's why these companies, these industries, what they do is, unlike drug abuse, they don't rely on creating the same thing all the time. They understand that for them to stimulate you and for you to remain addicted, they have to give you new content, new images, new videos, new people acting and performing in these videos. And that's how they entrap you. That's number two, finding the situational factor. And number three, looking at how society creates, maintains, or modifies these factors. Media influences, lack of jobs, and the lack of creativity in schools. And I'll add one, the lack of purpose in society. My dear brothers and sisters, I'll finish off by saying, how would Imam Hussein alayhi salam on this first night, discussing the virtue of courage, teach us to break from these chains? More than 2,000 years ago, a mathematician once said give me a place to stand and I will move the earth. You know what this means? When we take a stand, we can move the world of people and the ideas on which people act. Taking a stand is a way of living and being. It allows you to have a place in your legacy, in your history, in your society that defines who you truly are. This place will allow you to make a stand. It will allow you to say to evil no, like Abu Abdullah Hussein alayhi salam. You find your place in the world and you have the capacity to move the world. I asked Allah for strength and He gave me difficulties to make me strong. I asked Allah for wisdom and He gave me problems to learn how to solve. I asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for love and He gave me people to help. I asked Him for prosperity and favors and He gave me a mind, a body and a spirit. I asked Him for success and He gave me opportunities. I asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for what I wanted. I received nothing I wanted, but I received everything I needed. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.